In this episode, I say Dr. Urben is an adjunct professor at George Washington. I meant to say she is an adjunct professor at Georgetown. Please excuse my oversight. Welcome to Candid Leadership. It's great to have our guest, Dr. Heidi Urben, here with us today. Dr. Heidi Urben is an adjunct associate professor in the Security Studies program at George Washington University and an active duty colonel in the United States Army with more than 23 years of service. Dr. Urben's research interests include civil-military relations, public opinion, political behavior, and national security strategy. A career military intelligence officer, Dr. Urben recently finished command of a military intelligence brigade at Fort Meade, Maryland. She is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a visiting research fellow at the National Defense University Institute for National Strategic Studies. Welcome, Heidi Urben. So Heidi, it is great to have you here with us today at Candid Leadership. Thank you so much for taking your time out.
Thank you, Candace. It's great to have an opportunity to chat with you.
Well, I'm going to kind of dive into it. I've talked about your background a little bit and some of the work that you've done in seminal writing work on political participation. As we kind of march forward towards the election, we've talked at length about the partisanship of the officer corps. And I know you've done a significant amount of work on that. Would you mind kind of sharing some of the things that you have found through your work?
Sure. Thanks, Candace. Yeah, I've had a long-standing interest in kind of assessing the state of the nonpartisan ethic or the norm of nonpartisanship within the military, especially for those on active duty. And within that, I've had a particular interest in the officer corps. And I think we have, for the most part, I think the military understands why getting involved in politics can be dangerous and why letting our partisanship be known can be especially dangerous. But it's worth an extra reminder in every election year, especially in an election year like 2020. And so some of the things I've done in the past through survey research is to see how things have changed over time and maybe to what degree we're adhering to the norm of nonpartisanship or where it might weaken over time. And so, like I said, I don't tend to say we're in a constant crisis in civil-military relations, but there are a lot of areas for concern. And I think the language or the metaphor that resonates with me the most is this idea of a gradual, slow erosion of the norm of nonpartisanship. So while there may never be a single incident that stands out that is particularly troublesome, it's more of the gradual decline over time. And why that can be dangerous is it's very hard to go back and restore that norm when it has eroded. For all of us who've been in the military for more than a day or have been in professional military education settings, we know that norms don't just happen overnight. They are only maintained due to constant reinforcement and teaching, and when we can see that norm being adhered to. And so I think that especially in this election year, we need a good reminder of why that norm has served our all-volunteer force so well and why it's so important to maintain.
I think that's a great point. And you kind of speak towards the glacial change. You really don't see it happening. But then when you walk it backwards, you can kind of measure, hey, that change is monumental. Where are those areas you see it really not being taught, and kind of how would you work towards making that change?
I think one of the areas that is of most concern in the past decade or so has been how we let our politics be aired through social media. And it may be that our adherence to the norm has been relatively constant throughout the all-volunteer force. The difference is the advent of social media that allows us to broadcast our opinions in a way that we couldn't really do back in the 1980s or the 1990s. And so that is an area of particular concern for me. You know, social media provides often a written, lasting record and is definitely the public sphere, the public town square in modern times today. That's where I think we could use some better reinforcement and teaching of that norm. The other thing is, because we've never really been in a full civil-military relations crisis in the all-volunteer force, I think we've taken the norm for granted. And so when you look at a lot of professional military education settings, it's taken for granted that it's well inculcated in the officer corps and doesn't need more reinforcement. And when you really take a look at it, I think our service academies do a pretty good job of starting officers out with that understanding. But the likelihood that a mid-grade officer or senior officer is going to have that be touched upon again is actually pretty low. So I'm not suggesting that the only venue for a recommitment to the norm of nonpartisanship is through schooling. Absolutely not. I think schooling is one important part, but these are discussions that need to be taking place at unit levels across all branches of the military. Leaders have to be comfortable talking about this and why the norm's so important. Where do we draw its lineage from and why does it matter, especially today?
And that actually draws me to your seminal work, Like, Comment, and Retweet. I know that work was done in 2017, and there will be a forthcoming book someday. I anxiously await. But the work that you did with that, you lightly also touched on leadership and with respect to kind of the role of retired generals and flag officers. Could you kind of talk about the accumulation of some of the higher ranking military officials and their involvement in politics as well?
Yeah, there's definitely disagreement on whether the norm should extend into retirement or not. A lot of folks look at it as, hey, served your full career. You should be able to have your First Amendment rights just like any other citizen. And in most cases, I agree with that. Where I disagree is I think our general and flag officers are held and should be held to a different standard. And one of my favorite lines is from former history professor at University of North Carolina, Richard Cohn, who said that retired four-stars, especially, are like princes of the church. They never truly retire. I do not believe, and I think that we've got really good research that attests to this, that the American public does not draw a distinction between active duty and retired general and flag officers. So when a retired general officer speaks politically and makes partisan pronouncements, especially through partisan endorsements at election time, they're giving the impression that they still speak for the institution. And I find that very problematic. And there's been nothing but an increase in the number of partisan endorsements for presidential elections starting back in 1988. And that's a real concern on what that does to the professional ethic. And it causes those on active duty to wonder, well, gosh, that used to be my commanding general. And I never realized that he or she felt that way until they're retired and they're talking about this. And so just having that reminder that especially for our retired general and flag officers, they serve a particular function for the entire profession. And I don't think that stops when they retire.
I think that's fantastic and kind of pulling away from maybe the civil military side, but talking about, people that in any national security field or any office, partisan politics and kind of the identification of partisanship, what are some of the impacts that you see to the workforce and what would you do about that?
Yeah, I think this is not just unique to the military. It has a special case for the military because it is written into the Constitution that we are subordinate to civilian authority. But when you look more broadly, even with the entire federal government, there are some similar rules and directives that apply to the federal workforce, just like the military. The military is governed by Department of Defense Directive 1344.10 that provides a list of do's and don'ts on political behavior for those on active duty. And for our civilian counterparts in the federal government, the Hatch Act does a very similar do's and don'ts. If we restrict ourselves, however, to those core documents, it tends to have a very legalistic discussion. And you talk about, can you do this? Can you do that? Instead, I think more broadly, we want to have a conversation of, even if you can, should you?
Right.
And the appropriateness of this. And that's where I think, to your question, comes back to the impact to a workforce, to an organization, when those you are working very closely with and have to have a degree of trust to have a good, productive climate and working relationship, it really requires all folks, whether they're in the military or in the federal workforce, to leave their politics at the door. And then when they bring in partisanship into the equation, I think it can create some trust issues within that work environment.
Exactly. And that cohesion is so important in any work environment. I mean, the last thing you want to do is really bifurcate your workforce just because of something you said. And I think people sometimes feel right now they have to walk on eggshells. And even though they may have a checklist of, okay, you can do that, you can't do this, and you see it on Twitter, I see it all over social media. These, what I say, they do not reflect the views of where I work. But it's still an issue. So, kind of when you're looking at social media, what are some of those things that you see that we could use social media for good? And how have you done that in the past, Heidi?
The last thing I would want to suggest is that for those in the uniformed military or in the federal workforce, that we should be wary of social media or that we should keep it at arm's length. I'm simply advocating that we should be thoughtful about what we post, but it can be a wonderful tool in connecting organizations together. Certainly as a commander in the past in the Army, we really relied extensively on social media to get out important information to our family members. Many of our units are geographically dispersed, especially when you get into organizations that are far-flung all over the globe. Social media can be a wonderful way to extend the reach of the organization, bring our families closer together, put out critical information very quickly. I found that it was very useful to put out a lot of important information around COVID-19 and the pandemic and how it was shaping and impacting our organization through social media. So it can be a really wonderful tool. We just want to be thoughtful about it. And to your point about folks walking on eggshells, I think especially now we should be really thoughtful about what we post and what we say. It is a really divisive time in our country's politics, and people are especially sensitive. And I think it's because of those reasons, especially now, we just want to be extra thoughtful about what we say.
So, who in your mind's eye uses Twitter or Facebook or Instagram? Who is like your go to person to say, you know what, they use it right?
I'm always looking for, I think, in terms of our active duty leadership, folks who do it well. And one that I've been following of late and greatly amused by is the TRADOC Deputy Commanding General, Lieutenant General Martin. He has a fantastic use of social media and shows that general officers can even have a good sense of humor. So if you haven't checked out his Twitter feed, I would highly recommend you do so.
Yes, yes. He does poke fun at the infantry quite often. So I and I do recall, Heidi, you and I go way back. You have a pretty mean sense of humor yourself, especially around the time when Peeps come out. If any of you are fortunate enough to get to see some of Dr. Urban's epic Peep pictures, she is top notch. I mean, she's successful in many ways as a professor, as a commander, as a human being, a decent human being in life. Once a year, she does show her creativity and prowess.
Yeah, one of the units I was in, we took it very seriously, and at Easter would have a peep diorama contest, and it's amazing what you can stage with marshmallow chickens and bunnies. So
There
highly
you
endorse.
go. There you go. Little did I know until I met you how a diorama could exist with that. So, a couple of other areas that I would love to dive into. We've talked quite a bit about areas that you write on. And of course, I keep reminding my listeners, I will have the attachment to her seminal work. And when her book comes out, I will shamelessly promote this all over social media to say I was there talking to her before the book came out. She's got a phenomenal way of kind of really demonstrating why this issue is so important. But on a different topic, on leadership, we've talked at length about mentorship and why it's so important. And what are some of those bits of advice that you would give to mentors?
A couple things. I think, first off, for mentors, we all know that the single most important value a senior leader brings to any organization is their time. And in most workplaces, there's an inverse relationship between level of responsibility and discretionary time. So the longer you serve and the higher you go, the less free time you have. And yet, perhaps the most important thing that senior leader might do is devoting that precious time to junior leaders. I don't know many senior leaders who are adverse to mentoring. Most probably say it's the highlight of what they do. But I have watched many let their calendars get the best of them, and they inadvertently close themselves off to mentoring opportunities. There's a great Harvard Business Review article from a couple years ago called How CEOs Manage Their Time. That's a good look at the many different pressures that may crowd in on a senior leader, but just how many of the good ones purposely fence time to mentor.
I know there was another one that you talked about assessing people's strengths.
Yeah, there's a tendency for all mentors to advise people based on their own experiences. But that's not really mentoring. That's advocating, mimicking, and suggesting that there's only one path forward, the path that I followed, and you should follow that too. I think instead, mentors should provide the following disclaimers. Please take my suggestions with a grain of salt and recognize that I am biased. More so, if I've given you advice to go down a particular path, you should then go talk to somebody else who's going to advise you differently. So the real point about mentoring isn't and shouldn't be about encouraging somebody to follow your specific path. It's to assess somebody's strengths and weaknesses, to see what do they enjoy doing and what are they really good at, and how can they find where that overlaps and still be able to make a really good contribution, at least in our case, to the Army or whatever organization they're in. It's just a cautionary note for mentors. It's certainly understandable why we tend to advise based off our own experiences. But remember, mentors, the person who we're mentoring, they've sought us out for a particular reason to begin with. So there's already probably a relationship that's been established, but we don't need to necessarily only advise on the exact path that we've followed.
I think that's great advice as well, to kind of always provide one or two other people, kind of, alternate courses of action. Hey, this is my bias. This is what I see from my path, what I've charted. You've talked to me in the past about mentoring people that in the military, there are many different paths. The same way with federal government and where you're going right now into academics, not all roads lead to one particular destination. In the time that we have left, Dr. Urben, could you provide me with maybe an example of someone that mentored you and the impact that they had on your life?
So here's one. So I was very, very lucky as a junior major to have an opportunity to work for the Secretary of Defense at the time, Robert Gates. And I hold him up certainly as one of the best public servants that we've had. And I was very fortunate to be able to have a ringside seat to just how he carried himself and how he engaged with others. And to me, really stands out as just a wonderful example of selfless service. He was fond of quoting John Adams in a letter to his son, John Quincy Adams, when he was talking about public service. And the line goes something like, "Public business, my son, must be done by somebody. If wise men refuse it, others will not. If honest men refuse it, others will not." And I think about that quote, and I think about Secretary Gates' example during some really tough times in our recent history as a wonderful example that I call upon in difficult times, and a reminder of just how rewarding a career in public service can be.
Well, doubtlessly, anyone listening to this podcast today knows that you have gone the last full measure yourself with dedicating your life to public service. Well over 2 decades you have spent dedicated to the craft of not only being a professional, but studying the profession, adding to the academic work of the profession, and absolutely making a mark, not only to those you lead, but also your peers. And so it's been my true pleasure, Heidi, to have you on this podcast today. You are someone I have looked up to for many years. You have kind of been the torch that so many other leaders have looked towards to say, if I can be that good, or if I can lead that well. But I think what makes you such a phenomenal officer is that you've cleared the path for so many other people to express their greatness. So thank you so much for joining me today on Candid Leadership. And wherever your path next leads you, I know you'll have a very loud, boisterous person in myself to cheer you on.
Thanks, Candace. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to Candid Leadership. It was great to have Dr. Heidi Urben on our show today. She truly walked us through the reason why nonpartisanship is so important in national security, and especially the Department of Defense. I also appreciated the points that she made on mentorship and why it really matters. Even after years, she can still recall comments and quotes from one of her mentors. Thank you for listening to Candid Leadership. Please consider subscribing wherever you listen to your podcast.